Welcome to this special horror story compilation. In this video, we've gathered a series of chilling, spine-tingling tales based on real events, urban legends, and ghostly encounters. Perfect for those who want a full dose of horror, whether you're watching late at night or anytime you're in the mood for a thrill. Each story takes you through unique scenes of terror, from haunted places to unexplained disappearances. These tales are crafted to keep you on the edge of your seat, revealing terrifying secrets lurking in the shadows. So make sure to turn up the volume, get comfortable, and prepare for a journey into the unknown. If you enjoy the video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to support the channel. Tap the notification bell so you never miss any of our latest horror stories. Let's dive in and stay scared. Our first story reveals what happens when a seemingly ordinary midnight doorbell brings an unexpected and sinister visitor. It was around 2014 when this happened. I had just started my nursing internship at the hospital, and my family had moved into a new house a few years ago. We bought an electronic doorbell, the kind with a button outside and a chime inside the house. At that time, it was just me and my mom living there, two women with no relatives or friends nearby. So, when strange things started happening, our first thought was that it might be burglars scouting the area, but the more we thought about it, the less sense it made. The doorbell worked fine at first, but after a few days, strange things started happening. The first time, it was only my mom who heard it. Between 1 and 3 in the morning, the doorbell suddenly started ringing, ding-dong, very rhythmically, not too fast, not too slow, just continuously. My mom mentioned it subtly the next day, but I didn't pay much attention and went off to my internship. I don't remember the details clearly because I either slept through it or wasn't home at the time. Why didn't we call the police? Maybe my mom had her reasons. I didn't know much. She just subtly mentioned the doorbell ringing at midnight without making it sound too strange, so I didn't take it seriously. The second time was the night I found out about it, around the same time. I was jolted awake by the piercing doorbell sound. The moment I got up, it was pure terror. Dark room, piercing doorbell sound. The bedroom door was closed, and the sound of the doorbell was particularly loud, amplified by the night's silence. Ding-dong, 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 continuously. My mom and I tiptoed to the peephole, but the outside light was off, and it was too dark to see anything. We had to open the door to turn on the corridor light. It rang for a while, and my mom shouted, "Who is it? If you knock again, I'll call the police." There was dead silence outside, and the ringing stopped for a while, then started again, ding-dong, ding-dong, ding-dong. It was too piercing, and I didn't know what to do. My mom picked up the phone to call the police, but didn't for some reason. Luckily, except for the ringing, there were no other disturbances that night. The ringing stopped after a while, and the next day my mom went to the security guard to check the surveillance, but the cameras weren't on. She left her number and told the guard to catch whoever was knocking if it happened again. The third time was the same night we contacted the security guard. Sometimes the corridor light would be turned off by the neighbors, and we were already very scared, so we didn't tell the neighbors not to turn off the light. When the doorbell rang again that night, it was still pitch black outside the peephole. The scariest part was not the startling ding-dong sound. When we shouted that we were going to call the police, the doorbell noticeably paused for a second and then started being pressed frantically. Ding-dong, 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 so rapidly that the doorbell couldn't produce the normal sound, and the tone changed. My mom called the police this time, but the surveillance didn't show anyone entering the building, and the security guard was too scared to come upstairs. The atmosphere gave me severe anxiety that has lasted for years. Even now, hearing a doorbell or knocking can make me hyperventilate and my legs go weak. My mom decisively unplugged the doorbell, and we made it through the night. The next day, the weather was overcast as if it was going to rain, very dark, and the lighting in the house was dim and yellowish. I was flipping through a book in the living room when the doorbell suddenly rang. Tears welled up in my eyes from the scare. I mustered up the courage to look, and I could only see my mom squatting with her back to me. I couldn't even see her profile. She was pressing the doorbell, ding-dong, ding-dong, then started adjusting the doorbell sound, and then the volume. I was about to cry, mustering up the courage to shout "Mom," but she didn't respond, didn't even react, just kept fiddling with the doorbell. I was paralyzed with fear, and after a while, she suddenly stood up without even glancing at me. I didn't dare bring it up again. It was too creepy. The fourth time was a few days later. We thought the previous police call had scared off whoever was outside. That night, close to dawn, the doorbell rang again. There was no one outside the peephole, but the doorbell kept ringing. My mom said she would open the door, and I hid behind it, feeling like we were in a life-or-death situation. Once the door was open, there was no one there. The doorbell stopped ringing as soon as the door opened. After that, it never happened again. The same doorbell is still in our house, but it never rings at night anymore. However, the psychological shadow it left remains. Later, one night, I went out to take out the trash in the same building. The corridor was very dark, and the hallway lights were button-operated, installed at the entrance of each apartment, with only one button per 2 apartments. That night, I didn't bring my phone, which I usually have with me at all times, thinking I'd be quick. When I returned, the elevator stopped at a floor, and the door suddenly opened. Typically, the neighbors don't leave the hallway lights on to save electricity. The elevator faces the stairs, with only a bit of light coming from the stairway window, barely enough to see anything. The elevator itself was brightly lit, and when the door opened, I saw no one, and the neighbors' doors were tightly shut. I didn't think much of it, pressed the close button, but halfway through closing, it felt like someone pushed the door, and it opened again. I tried closing it again, and it opened halfway. With no phone, I had no choice but to muster the courage to dash out of the elevator. I thought I could take the stairs, just a few more floors to home. Running up the dim stairway, I saw a black stroller with its canopy open, facing away from the stairs, and a wooden board blocking the way like a makeshift gate. Honestly, I wouldn't have dared go near it even without the blockage. I didn't want to stay, so I decided to run down. The elevator, still on my floor, should have moved by now, but it hadn't. Strangely, once I left, the elevator door closed. I didn't dare turn on the lights, just bolted downstairs. Reaching the next floor, I encountered the eeriest scene. Piles of shoes scattered haphazardly, covering every inch of the small landing. It felt like the floor was covered in debris, preventing me from stepping anywhere. A strong sense of fear overwhelmed me, like seeing a corpse. I forced myself to press the elevator button, and it came down to my floor. I got in, and this time it took me home smoothly. When I told my mom, she immediately dismissed it, saying the elevator had been malfunctioning recently. After experiencing these eerie events, I began to wonder what caused these doorbell rings. Was it a technical glitch, a prank, or some inexplicable supernatural phenomenon? Every time I recall these incidents, I get chills. If the midnight doorbell hasn't sent chills down your spine, this haunted mansion filled with restless spirits is sure to draw you deeper into the realm of the unknown. Tomoko and Yumi met in their first year of university and quickly became best friends. University life was supposed to be a time of joy and new experiences. But for Tomoko, everything changed when her mother suddenly passed away in their freshman year. Tomoko turned quiet, spending most of her days alone, sitting by the classroom window, lost in thought. Whenever she saw other students laughing and chatting with their parents, she felt a deep pain and emptiness inside. Yumi, a cheerful and optimistic girl, couldn't bear to see her friends so down. She wanted to help Tomoko get out of her sadness and suggested they spend the summer break together at her grandmother's house in her hometown. It's a big, beautiful old mansion with a large garden. The air is fresh, and you'll feel much better, Yumi said, hoping to lift Tomoko's spirits. Tomoko's father agreed, thinking it might be good for his daughter to get away and not be constantly reminded of her loss. So, with a mix of anticipation and unease, Tomoko joined Yumi on a trip to the countryside, hoping to find some peace. The journey from Tokyo to Yumi's hometown was long and tiring. They took several hours by train, watching as the bustling cityscape gradually gave way to vast fields, rolling hills, and serene countryside. The train finally pulled into a tiny station with barely any passengers. From there, they switched to a bus that meandered through winding rural roads, lined with dense forests and endless rice paddies. Occasionally, They passed a few scattered farmhouses, their thatched roofs peeking out among the greenery. The fields glowed in the afternoon sun, and farmers were busy tending to their crops. When they finally got off at a small town's last stop, they were greeted by a tranquil, almost timeless landscape. The air was crisp and filled with the scent of soil and fresh grass, far removed from the noise of the city. After disembarking, they still had to walk a winding path through the woods. The trail was covered by tall trees, with sunlight filtering through the leaves, creating a dappled pattern on the ground. A clear stream ran alongside, and birds occasionally flitted overhead. "This place is beautiful. It feels like stepping back in time," Tomoko said, taking in the serene surroundings. Yumi smiled and nodded. "Yes, it hasn't changed much. It always feels like coming home." After nearly an hour of walking, they finally arrived at Yumi's grandmother's house, a grand old mansion nestled deep in the woods. The mansion was a classic example of traditional Japanese architecture, exuding a sense of history and mystery. The roof was covered in dark tiles, and the walls were weathered with age. Wind chimes hung under the eaves, gently ringing in the breeze. In the courtyard, ancient pine trees stood tall, their branches twisting like old arms, and the ground was covered with moss, giving the place a sense of being untouched by time. "This is my grandmother's house," Yumi said, a hint of pride in her voice. Tomoko was awestruck. The mansion, though aged, still retained a sense of grandeur and quiet dignity. Stone lanterns lined the entrance, and the mansion was surrounded by high walls, giving it a secluded, almost fortress-like feel. They pushed open the heavy wooden doors and stepped into the courtyard. Inside, the garden was lush with plants, old stone pathways, and ancient stone lanterns that stood guard along the way. As Tomoko breathed in, she was met with a strange, unsettling smell. A sour, rotten stench mixed with the musty scent of damp wood. Yumi noticed Tomoko's expression and quickly explained, "My grandmother's been making a lot of pickles lately, so the smell is a bit strong." Tomoko forced a smile, though she couldn't shake the feeling that the odor was more than just pickles. It was as if something had been left to rot in the dark, hidden corners of the mansion. Inside, Yumi's grandmother welcomed them warmly. She was a kind-looking elderly woman with white hair and a gentle demeanor. She greeted Tomoko with kindness, expressing delight at having visitors. The grandmother explained that the strange odor was due to her making pickles that were stored in the basement. Tomoko felt somewhat reassured, although the smell continued to bother her. The grandmother led them through the mansion, showing them each room. The rooms were separated by traditional paper sliding doors, and the walls were adorned with old paintings depicting scenes of noble life in ancient Japan. The wooden floors creaked with every step, echoing through the long, shadowy corridors. The decor was elegant, but the air felt heavy and cold, as if the mansion held onto the memories of long-forgotten times. Tomoko noticed how dark and narrow the hallways were, and the flickering light from outside barely illuminated the dim rooms. The entire mansion seemed to be wrapped in a veil of melancholy, a sense of stillness that made Tomoko's skin crawl. As she walked through the corridors, she felt as though the eyes from the old paintings followed her every move, watching silently from the past. The next morning, Yumi suggested they explore the nearby fields and forest. The early morning air was cool, and the dense forest that surrounded the mansion seemed both inviting and mysterious. They walked along a narrow path that led deeper into the woods, where tall trees formed a canopy overhead, their branches intertwining like ancient, gnarled hands. The sunlight struggled to pierce through the thick foliage, creating an ever-shifting dance of light and shadow on the ground. "There's a big temple nearby. It's quite special," Yumi said as they made their way up an old stone staircase, covered in moss and partially obscured by overgrown bushes. The steps wound upward, and as they climbed, Tomoko noticed how the forest around them grew denser, the air cooler and quieter. Eventually, the temple came into view, a grand structure hidden deep within the forest. Its towering red gates stood imposingly against the backdrop of green, and the walls of the temple were adorned with intricate carvings that told stories of old. The place felt ancient and untouched, a forgotten corner of the world where time seemed to move slower. But what caught Tomoko's attention was the small stone statue near the entrance. The statue was about knee-high, depicting a childlike figure with a sorrowful expression, hands clasped in prayer. Next to the statue stood a plain, unmarked gravestone, its surface weathered and cracked, with no inscriptions to hint at its purpose. Beneath the gravestone, a bamboo tube channeled water from the mountain, letting it drip rhythmically onto the stone, producing a hollow, haunting sound that echoed in the stillness. Tomoko felt a chill run down her spine as she stared at the statue and the gravestone. There was an air of sadness around them, something deeply unsettling that she couldn't quite place. Remembering the rice cake her grandmother had given them earlier, Tomoko decided to offer it to the statue. She knelt down, placed the rice cake at the statue's feet, and clasped her hands in a quiet prayer, hoping to bring some peace to whatever spirit lingered there. As she closed her eyes, the sound of the dripping water grew louder, more insistent, like a strange Morse code tapping away in the silence. Tomoko's heart began to race, and she quickly stood up, feeling as if she was intruding on something sacred and forgotten. She tugged at Yumi's sleeve, urging her to leave. "What's wrong?" Yumi asked, noticing the unease on Tomoko's face. "I don't know. That statue and the grave, they just feel wrong," Tomoko whispered, casting one last glance at the small figure before they turned away. They made their way back to the mansion, but Tomoko couldn't shake the sense of dread that had settled in her chest. The image of the statue's sorrowful face and the sound of the dripping water lingered in her mind like an unwanted guest, refusing to leave. She couldn't explain why, but something about that place felt terribly, hauntingly wrong. By the time they returned to the mansion, the sun had already set. Yumi's grandmother had prepared a hearty dinner for them, with various dishes laid out on the table. However, Tomoko quickly noticed that each dish contained pickles in some form, whether mixed into the salad, served as a side, or even flavoring the soup. The pungent, sour smell of the pickles filled the room, mingling with the stale, musty odor that Tomoko had smelled earlier. She forced herself to eat, trying not to gag at the overpowering scent. After dinner, the mansion fell into a heavy silence. Tomoko lay on her futon, staring at the ceiling. The wooden beams creaked faintly, and the paper doors rustled in the gentle night breeze. The quietness was unsettling, broken only by the occasional whisper of wind against the paper-thin walls. Tomoko's mind kept drifting back to the temple, the stone statue, and the haunting sound of the dripping water. As she began to doze off, a soft, almost imperceptible sound reached her ears. A faint, rhythmic tapping, like the slow, deliberate footsteps of someone moving down the hallway. Tomoko's eyes snapped open. She held her breath, straining to listen. The sound grew louder, each step accompanied by the creak of old floorboards. It was slow, almost as if whoever was walking was dragging something heavy along. Tomoko cautiously turned her head towards the paper door that separated her room from the hallway. Through the thin paper, she could make out a shadow, a tall, slender figure moving ever so slowly down the corridor. It was a woman, her silhouette elongated and distorted by the dim moonlight that filtered through the window. She wore an old-style kimono, layers of fabric rustling softly as she moved. Her steps were heavy and deliberate, as though she carried the weight of centuries on her frail frame. Tomoko's heart pounded in her chest. She watched, frozen, as the figure continued to shuffle down the hallway, stopping just outside her door. The woman's face was obscured in shadow, but Tomoko could see the glimmer of dark, hollow eyes staring straight ahead, unmoving. A sudden wave of nausea hit her as the smell intensified. A fetid stench, far worse than the pickles, like something rotten and decaying. Terrified, Tomoko squeezed her eyes shut, pulling the covers up over her head. The footsteps stopped right outside her room, and Tomoko could feel the presence of the woman standing just on the other side of the door, watching her. She could hear a faint, ragged breathing, low, strained, as if the figure was struggling for air. Tomoko's mind raced. She desperately tried to rationalize what she was hearing. Perhaps it was just the wind, or her imagination playing tricks on her after a long, exhausting day. But deep down, She knew that this was no mere illusion. The air felt cold and oppressive, as if the very walls of the mansion were closing in on her. She lay still, her body rigid with fear, until finally, the footsteps resumed, shuffling away down the hallway. Only then did Tomoko dare to open her eyes, gasping for breath. She didn't sleep for the rest of the night, her senses on high alert, dreading that the shadowy figure might return. The following nights, Tomoko's unease only grew. Every time she tried to sleep, she could hear those faint footsteps echoing in the hallway, each step heavy with the weight of something unseen. The figure of the woman appeared night after night, pacing slowly in the corridor, her presence almost palpable through the thin paper doors. Tomoko's exhaustion mounted, and each night, the woman seemed to come closer, lingering longer outside Tomoko's room. One particularly dreadful night, Tomoko woke to find the paper door slightly ajar. The moonlight filtered into the room, casting pale beams that barely illuminated the futon where she lay. Tomoko's breath caught in her throat as she saw the woman standing right at the threshold of her room. The figure's face was partially obscured by the darkness, but Tomoko could make out the sallow, ghostly pallor of her skin. Her hair pulled back tightly in a traditional bun, framing a face devoid of expression. The woman's eyes were empty, sunken into her skull, and as she gazed into Tomoko's room, her lips moved ever so slightly as if she were whispering words that could not escape her throat. Tomoko felt paralyzed, as if an invisible force pinned her to her futon. The air grew thick and stifling, and Tomoko struggled to draw a breath. The stench of decay filled her nostrils, sickly sweet and overpowering, as if something long dead had been dragged into the room. Tomoko wanted to scream, but her voice seemed to have abandoned her. She could only watch in horror as the woman took a slow step forward, her wooden sandals clacking softly against the floor. The closer she got, the more distorted her features became, as if her face were melting under the pale light of the moon. Tomoko's vision blurred with tears of terror, and she squeezed her eyes shut, praying that it was all just a nightmare. But the footsteps didn't stop. The woman moved closer still, until Tomoko could feel the chill emanating from her ghostly figure. The woman's hand, pale and skeletal, reached out toward Tomoko, fingers trembling as if they were struggling to maintain their form. Just before the hand could touch her, Tomoko felt a sudden rush of cold air, and when she dared to open her eyes, the woman had vanished, leaving only the lingering scent of rot. The encounter left Tomoko shaken to her core. She spent the rest of the night curled up, wide-eyed and shivering, unable to close her eyes even for a moment. The next morning, she tried to tell Yumi what she had seen, but the words stuck in her throat. How could she explain something so horrifying, so inexplicable? Yumi tried to comfort her, attributing the experience to stress and lack of sleep, but Tomoko knew better. What she saw was real. As the days passed, Tomoko's fear deepened. She began to hear the woman's footsteps not just at night but also during the day, faint echoes that seemed to follow her through the mansion. Even in the bright light of morning, Tomoko felt as though the woman's shadow loomed just out of sight, watching her every move. She avoided the long corridors, opting to stay in the more well-lit areas of the mansion, but no place felt truly safe. One afternoon, while wandering through the mansion's extensive garden, Tomoko caught a glimpse of something that made her blood run cold. Near the old well at the far end of the garden, she saw the woman's silhouette reflected in the water. The figure stood still, unmoving, her back turned to Tomoko. Tomoko's breath hitched, and she blinked, but when she looked again, the reflection was gone. The well, ancient and covered in creeping vines, now seemed like a gaping mouth, silently swallowing the ghostly apparition back into the earth. Tomoko's grip on reality began to slip. Her dreams were haunted by visions of the woman, who now appeared not only in the corridors of the mansion but also in Tomoko's own room, standing at the foot of her bed. The dreams were so vivid that Tomoko often woke up drenched in sweat, her heart racing, convinced that the woman had been there, watching her sleep. Tomoko's nights turned into a blur of half-sleep and waking nightmares, each more terrifying than the last. Desperate for answers, Tomoko decided to confront Yumi's grandmother. She needed to know who the woman was and why she was haunting her. When Tomoko finally broke down and told Yumi's grandmother about her encounters, the old woman's face darkened with a mixture of sorrow and fear. She led Tomoko to the mansion's sitting room, where she retrieved an old photograph from a hidden drawer. The photograph was yellowed with age, depicting a beautiful young woman dressed in an elegant kimono, her expression serene yet melancholic. "This is the lady of the mansion," Yumi's grandmother said softly. "She was a noblewoman who lived here many generations ago. Her beauty was renowned, and many suitors came to seek her hand. But she fell in love with a young lord who ultimately betrayed her. She lost everything: her family, her honor, and her mind. She drowned her own newborn child in despair. Unable to cope with the shame, Tomoko stared at the photograph, feeling the cold weight of the tragedy that had played out in the very rooms she now walked through. "But why is she still here?" Tomoko asked, her voice trembling. Yumi's grandmother sighed deeply. "Her spirit never left this place. She wanders the corridors, searching for the peace she could never find in life. She's not here to harm you, Tomoko. She's trapped, unable to move on." Desperate to help Tomoko, Yumi's grandmother decided to perform a purification ritual to release the trapped spirit of the noblewoman. She gathered ancient incense, rare herbs, and a ceremonial robe passed down through generations. The grandmother set up an altar in the mansion's central room, where the air was thick with the weight of unspoken memories. The walls seemed to close in, shadows flickering in the dim candlelight. As the ritual began, Yumi's grandmother chanted in a low, rhythmic voice, reciting prayers that resonated through the room. The smoke from the incense curled and twisted, taking on strange shapes as it filled the air. Tomoko watched nervously, feeling a chill run through her body as the temperature in the room dropped. The flickering flames of the candles cast eerie shadows on the walls, making the old paintings seem to come alive. The grandmother's voice grew louder, more urgent, as she called upon the spirit of the noblewoman. Suddenly, the air became icy cold, and the shadowy figure of the woman appeared, materializing in the thick smoke. Her eyes were hollow and sorrowful, her once beautiful face now contorted by centuries of pain and regret. She stood there silently, her ghostly form wavering like a mirage. Tomoko felt an overwhelming wave of sadness wash over her. This was no malevolent spirit. It was the soul of a woman who had suffered beyond measure, forever bound to the place of her deepest sorrows. The grandmother continued her prayers, her voice breaking with emotion as she pleaded for the spirit to find peace. The noblewoman's figure began to fade, the edges of her form blurring into the smoke. As she slowly disappeared, her expression softened, and for the first time, she looked at Tomoko, not with malice, but with a deep, unspoken understanding. The scent of decay faded, replaced by the faint, bittersweet aroma of cherry blossoms. And then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, the spirit was gone. The room fell silent. Tomoko let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding, tears streaming down her face. She turned to Yumi's grandmother, who was wiping her own tears away. Why didn't she ever hurt you?" Tomoko asked softly, still shaken by the encounter. Yumi's grandmother looked at Tomoko, her eyes reflecting a deep well of sadness and empathy. "She never harmed me because, in some ways, we were the same," the grandmother began. "I was not the original owner of this mansion. I came here after marrying into the family. My husband, Yumi's grandfather, passed away many years ago, leaving me alone in this vast, empty house." The grandmother paused, her gaze drifting to the old pine tree outside, its twisted branches reaching skyward. "I have known loneliness, too. I lost my family, my husband, and I've spent many years living here in solitude, just like her." She saw that I was not a threat, but rather a kindred spirit, a woman abandoned by time, just as she was. Tomoko listened, her heart aching for the grandmother and the noblewoman whose lives had been so tragically intertwined. It was not fear or hatred that had kept the spirit at bay. It was a silent understanding, a shared suffering that transcended death. The grandmother continued, her voice softening. "Sometimes, on those lonely nights, When I heard her footsteps in the hallway, I didn't feel afraid. I felt accompanied. I knew she wasn't here to harm me. We were just two souls, caught between the living and the dead, each finding solace in the other's presence. Tomoko wiped her tears, feeling a deep respect for the grandmother and the spirit that had haunted the mansion for so long. She realized that the spirit's presence was not a curse but a lingering echo of a life marked by pain and loss. Tomoko knew she would never forget the noblewoman's sorrowful gaze or the quiet strength of Yumi's grandmother. As they prepared to leave the mansion, Tomoko looked back one last time. She imagined the noblewoman's spirit finally at peace, her restless wandering brought to an end by the grandmother's compassion and understanding. Though the mansion would always carry the weight of its tragic history, it no longer felt like a place of fear but one of remembrance, a silent tribute to those who had suffered within its walls. As Tomoko and Yumi prepared to leave, the atmosphere in the mansion felt noticeably lighter, as if the oppressive weight that had hung over the old house had finally been lifted. Yumi's grandmother bid them farewell with a warm smile, though her eyes held the sadness of someone who had seen far too much. Before they left, she handed Tomoko a small keepsake, a delicate handkerchief embroidered with cherry blossoms. This belonged to her, the grandmother explained softly. I found it tucked away in the mansion many years ago. I think she would want you to have it. Tomoko held the handkerchief in her hands, feeling the delicate fabric and tracing the intricate pattern of the blossoms. It was a simple object, but it carried the weight of history and sorrow, a tangible connection to the woman whose spirit had finally found peace. Tomoko bowed deeply to Yumi's grandmother, expressing her gratitude not only for her hospitality, but also for her compassion and understanding. As they walked down the long, winding path away from the mansion, Tomoko turned back one last time. The old house stood silent and still, bathed in the soft morning light. The pine trees swayed gently in the breeze, and the distant sound of a temple bell echoed faintly through the air. Tomoko felt a strange sense of closure, knowing that the mansion and the spirit within it would remain forever bound by the threads of history. On the journey back to the city, Tomoko and Yumi sat quietly on the train, the rhythmic clattering of the tracks creating a soothing backdrop to their thoughts. Tomoko gazed out the window, watching as the scenery gradually shifted from lush countryside to urban sprawl. The events of the past few days played over in her mind, and she found herself reflecting deeply on the encounters she had experienced. The noblewoman's story had moved her in ways she hadn't expected. Tomoko realized that the spirit wasn't just an ominous presence or a haunting figure. She was a symbol of lost dreams, unfulfilled promises, and the enduring pain of a heart that had been shattered beyond repair. The noblewoman's suffering was a reminder of the fragile nature of human life and the desperate need for connection, even beyond death. Yumi broke the silence, her voice gentle yet contemplative. Do you think she's finally at peace now? Tomoko nodded slowly. I think so. Thanks to your grandmother. She's no longer trapped by her own sorrow. It's like she was waiting for someone to understand her, someone to tell her it was okay to let go. They fell silent again, and Tomoko felt a profound sense of gratitude. She had been given a glimpse into a world that few could understand, a world where pain, love, and loss intertwined in ways that defied the boundaries of life and death. She knew that the mansion and its tragic history would stay with her forever, a quiet reminder of the spirits that linger just beyond the veil of reality. Tomoko reached into her bag and pulled out the handkerchief, gazing at the delicate cherry blossoms embroidered on the fabric. She felt a connection, not only to the noblewoman but also to Yumi's grandmother and the unspoken bond they all shared. It was a bond forged through empathy, understanding, and the shared experience of sorrow. As the train sped toward the city, Tomoko closed her eyes and let the rhythmic sounds of the journey lull her into a sense of calm. The nightmare was over, but the memories would remain, etched in her mind like the faint scent of cherry blossoms on a spring breeze, bittersweet and enduring. She knew that no matter where life took her, the lessons of the mansion would guide her, reminding her that sometimes the most haunted places are not the ones filled with ghosts, but those that carry the weight of unspoken stories and forgotten sorrows. As Tomoko settled back into her routine in the bustling city, She tried to forget the haunting events of the mansion. Yet, some nights, when the city was quiet and she found herself alone, Tomoko could still hear faint echoes of dripping water, just like in the temple. She brushed it off as her mind playing tricks on her. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that the spirit of the noblewoman was still lingering somewhere in the shadows. One evening, as Tomoko was unpacking her bag, she pulled out the handkerchief Yumi's grandmother had given her. The delicate cherry blossoms stitched into the fabric seemed to have lost some of their color, now appearing dull and faded. A faint, bittersweet aroma of cherry blossoms filled the air. But there was something else, something darker, a familiar, sickly scent that sent a chill down her spine. Tomoko froze, holding the handkerchief tightly. She glanced around her small apartment, half expecting to see the ghostly figure of the noblewoman standing in the corner. But there was nothing, just the quiet hum of the city outside. Tomoko tried to shake off the unease, but the feeling lingered, like an unfinished whisper echoing in the back of her mind. Perhaps some stories never truly end. Perhaps some spirits never find peace. The haunted mansion was only the beginning. Now, we turn to the disturbing experiences of a doctor who has faced unexplainable horrors in places you'd least expect. These 4 terrifying encounters may make you see hospitals in a whole new, terrifying light. Chapter 1. Dr. Phillips had worked at the bustling city hospital for over 7 years. It was a place where the boundaries between life and death constantly blurred, and where whispers of eerie events circulated among the staff like the hospital's own brand of folklore. Phillips had always been a skeptic when it came to supernatural tales, until the night he experienced something that shook him to his core. It was a quiet Tuesday night when Phillips began his shift. The hospital was unusually still, the kind of silence that felt heavy, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, casting an eerie, cold glow across the deserted hallways. Phillips settled into the nurse's station, flipping through patient charts when a young nurse named Lily rushed in, her face pale and eyes wide with anxiety. "Doctor, the alarm by the emergency exit keeps going off. I've checked it twice, but there's no one there and nothing seems wrong," she said, her voice trembling slightly. Phillips glanced at the clock. It was nearly midnight. Alarms weren't uncommon, but they were usually triggered by patients or staff accidentally pushing the emergency exit door. He sighed, more annoyed than concerned, and decided to investigate. The emergency exit in question was located at the far end of a rarely used corridor on the hospital's oldest floor. It was a spot avoided by most of the staff, rumored to be haunted due to its age and past incidents that no one could fully explain. As Phillips made his way down the corridor, the overhead lights flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. He shrugged off the unsettling feeling as he approached the door. Upon arrival, Phillips inspected the emergency exit thoroughly. The door was locked securely, the alarm system appeared intact, and no one was in the area. He manually reset the alarm system, believing it to be a simple technical malfunction. But as soon as he turned to leave, the alarm blared again, louder and more insistent, as if mocking his efforts. Phillips returned to the nurse's station with Lily, hoping to resolve the issue from there. However, the moment they stepped inside, the alarm began ringing once more, piercing the silence of the night. The sound was sharp, jarring, almost invasive. It echoed through the sterile halls, growing louder and louder as if the entire hospital were amplifying its call. Phillips tried everything, resetting the system, checking the circuits, even turning off the entire alarm mechanism. But the sound persisted, haunting them with its relentless rhythm. The following nights, the alarm continued its eerie performance, but only when the young nurse Lily was on duty. Midnight marked the start of the nightmare each time, and no amount of troubleshooting or checks could find the fault. Phillips began to notice a pattern. It was as if the alarm had a will of its own, tied inexplicably to Lily's presence. She grew increasingly distressed, and Phillips himself started to feel a creeping dread each time he heard the first notes of that shrill, unending alarm. To try and isolate the problem, the head nurse decided to change Lily's shift to later in the night, hoping that altering her routine might stop the phenomenon. But when Lily came in at 3 a.m. one night, the alarm resumed, even louder and more chaotic than before. By this point, Lily was visibly shaken, constantly on edge. She confided in Phillips, revealing that the alarm sound followed her home, haunting her sleep and echoing in her mind like a curse she couldn't escape. Finally, overwhelmed and terrified, Lily took a leave of absence and eventually resigned from the hospital, unable to cope with the incessant alarm that seemed to target her alone. Before she left, she told Phillips, her voice quivering, "It's not just a sound anymore. It's like something wants me to remember, to never forget that it's there." Phillips, deeply disturbed by the whole experience, continued to work at the hospital, but the memory of the relentless alarm stayed with him. The technical department inspected the system numerous times but could never find the source of the malfunction. The mysterious ringing was never resolved, and soon after, more nurses began to whisper about the haunted corridor and its cursed alarm. It became a tale passed down among the night shift workers, a story that left a chilling imprint on all who heard it. Phillips, too, could never shake the sense that something more sinister had been at play, something that defied all rational explanation and left a lingering sense of unease that haunted the dark corners of the hospital. Finally, overwhelmed and terrified, Lily took a leave of absence and eventually resigned from the hospital, unable to cope with the incessant alarm that seemed to target her alone. Before she left, she told Phillips, her voice quivering, "It's not just a sound anymore. It's like something wants me to remember, to never forget that it's there." Phillips felt a chill run down his spine but could do nothing but watch as Lily walked away. The technical department inspected the alarm system multiple times but could never find the source of the malfunction. The mystery of the alarm remained unsolved, gradually becoming a haunting tale whispered among the hospital staff. For Phillips, this experience became a deep shadow in his career, an unsettling memory that lingered, making him uneasy during every night shift. But the story didn't end there. A few months later, on another late night when Phillips was working overtime, he found himself alone on duty. As he patrolled the quiet corridor, a familiar, piercing alarm suddenly echoed in his ears, short and sharp, like a mocking laugh reverberating through the darkness. He quickly looked up, but the old lights at the end of the hallway only flickered slightly, and everything seemed normal. Phillips froze for a moment, staring down the corridor, as if waiting for some kind of response. But the alarm didn't sound again, and the hallway returned to a deathly silence. Phillips hurried back to the nurse's station, his heart pounding. He checked the alarm system records, but nothing was out of the ordinary. At that moment, he felt a cold sensation crawling up his spine, as if unseen eyes were watching him from the shadows. Standing alone in the deserted hallway, the lights cast long, eerie shadows behind him. The echo of the alarm seemed to linger in his mind, refusing to fade. Phillips realized that whatever had happened, it wasn't over. The alarm felt like a warning, a reminder that the unexplainable events still lurked in the dark corners of the hospital, waiting for another unknown moment to reveal themselves once more. Chapter 2. Dr. Phillips was no stranger to strange occurrences in the hospital, but this particular experience stood out as one of the most unsettling. It all began when he received an emergency call late one evening about a patient who claimed to have seen a shadowy figure in a specific room. The patient, visibly shaken, insisted that the figure wasn't a hallucination. Phillips, initially skeptical, decided to investigate. The room in question was on an old, rarely used floor of the hospital, a place steeped in rumors of eerie occurrences. The floor had long been associated with ghost stories and whispered warnings among the staff, with many nurses avoiding it altogether. Two of Phillips' regular night shift nurses, Susan and Emily, had also mentioned hearing strange noises and seeing odd shadows but had never dared to look deeper. That evening, Dr. Phillips, along with Susan and Emily, ventured into the old ward. The air felt different as they stepped inside, cold, almost suffocating. The door was ajar, as if inviting them into its shadowy confines. Phillips pushed the door open wider, and they stepped inside, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the thick, unsettling quiet of the room. The lights flickered weakly overhead, casting long, distorted shadows that danced on the walls, twisting and shifting in ways that seemed almost deliberate. As they began their inspection, everything appeared normal at first glance. Beds were neatly made, equipment was in its place, and nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Yet, the atmosphere was heavy, thick with a palpable sense of unease. Susan whispered nervously, "I've heard things in here before." Low whispers, like someone talking but you can't quite make out the words. She pointed to a spot near the wall where she claimed to have seen shadows moving on their own. Emily, on the other hand, stayed silent but visibly tense. She kept glancing around, her eyes darting to the corners of the room as if expecting something to emerge from the darkness. Phillips noted the unease in her posture, but before he could say anything, the lights began to flicker more violently, plunging the room intermittently into darkness. The shadows on the walls started to distort, becoming more erratic and seemingly alive. Phillips watched in disbelief as the shapes morphed, one moment resembling a person, the next a grotesque, twisting figure that defied description. The temperature in the room dropped sharply, and Phillips felt a chill run through him, as if a cold hand had grazed his spine. Suddenly, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang, trapping them inside. Phillips rushed to the door, but no matter how hard he pushed, it wouldn't budge. He inspected the lock and noticed it was old and rusty, which might have contributed to the door jamming, but the timing felt too coincidental to be a mere mechanical failure. The room was plunged into chaos as the flickering lights intensified, and the shadows seemed to grow bolder, crawling across the walls like living creatures. A high-pitched, piercing scream erupted from the darkness, mingling with the soft, unintelligible whispers that seemed to come from every corner. Susan panicked, clutching her phone and desperately trying to call for help, but the screen was filled with static, the signal completely cut off. Emily stood frozen, her eyes wide with terror, unable to speak or move as the shadows closed in. The walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting as if the room itself were alive. Phillips could feel the oppressive presence bearing down on them, a weight that made it difficult to breathe. In a desperate attempt, Phillips slammed his shoulder against the door repeatedly, finally managing to force it open. The three of them stumbled out into the hallway, gasping for breath, their faces pale and hearts racing. They quickly sealed the room, and the door clicked shut behind them, the finality of the sound echoing in the silent corridor. Following the incident, the hospital administration launched a detailed investigation. Technicians were brought in to inspect the room's electrical systems, wiring, and door mechanisms. They reported that the flickering lights were due to faulty wiring and aging circuits, common in the older parts of the hospital. The door's sudden jamming was attributed to rust and disuse, but none of these explanations accounted for the shadows or the voices that Phillips and the nurses had experienced. Security footage from the hallway outside the room was reviewed multiple times. However, the footage only showed the door shutting on its own but captured no visible presence that could explain the disturbances inside. The room was temporarily sealed off, and the staff was warned not to enter until further notice. Phillips couldn't shake off the unease from that night. He spent hours researching the room's history and discovered that years ago, it had been used as a psychiatric ward. One record in particular caught his attention, a case involving a disturbed patient who had committed suicide in that very room. The patient had been plagued by hallucinations of shadowy figures and voices that whispered incomprehensible things to him. His death was ruled a suicide, but the attending physician's notes hinted at something more sinister. Strange, unexplainable phenomena that had been reported in the days leading up to his death. Phillips shared these findings with Susan and Emily, who were equally disturbed. They couldn't help but draw connections between their experience and the tragic history of the room. Phillips often found himself standing outside the sealed door during his rounds, listening intently, half expecting to hear the faint whispers or the sound of the door creaking open. One night, unable to sleep, Phillips returned to the sealed ward. The corridor was dimly lit, the air thick with an unspoken tension. As he examined the old door closely, he noticed something he had never seen before. A faint, almost imperceptible markings scratched into the wood. It was a series of chaotic lines that resembled a human figure, twisted and distorted, just like the shadows they had seen on the walls. Phillips quickly photographed the markings and sent them to the hospital's historical archives department, hoping to find any links. The archivist later informed him that similar symbols had been found etched on the walls of other old psychiatric facilities, often associated with patients who claimed to be haunted by shadowy presences. Phillips left the ward that night with a renewed sense of dread. The discovery of the markings only deepened the mystery, suggesting that the room's dark history had left an indelible mark that refused to fade. For Phillips, the ward was no longer just an old, abandoned space. It was a place where the past continued to bleed into the present, a reminder that some rooms never truly forget the horrors they have witnessed. Every time Phillips passes by that room now, he feels a chill, a reminder of the night when the shadows came alive. He often wonders if, one day, the door might creak open once more, inviting him back into its dark embrace. Chapter 3. Dr. Phillips had witnessed many unsettling events during his time at the hospital, but none as disturbing as what happened one fateful night. It all started with one of his long-term patients, an elderly woman in her 70s battling late-stage lung cancer. Under Phillips' care for months, she regularly came in for chemotherapy. Although she never knew the full extent of her illness, her 2 daughters were fully aware and chose not to tell her the complete truth to protect her. As the woman's condition deteriorated, her daughters reluctantly agreed to bring her home for palliative care, only returning to the hospital to pick up medications. On the night before her discharge, Phillips was on duty and went to visit her. The woman, visibly weakened, asked Phillips directly if her time was running out. Phillips, bound by professional ethics, avoided the question, offering comforting but hollow reassurances that she would feel better soon, knowing her prognosis was grim. That night, Phillips tried to rest in the on-call room, but an uneasy feeling lingered. Around 2 a.m., he was startled awake by a loud, insistent knocking on his door. Expecting an emergency call from a nurse, he quickly put on his coat and mask, ready to assist. As he approached the door, the knocking stopped abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence that felt unnatural. When Phillips opened the door, he was immediately overwhelmed by an unbearable stench, a sickening mix of rot and decay that filled the air. He almost retched as the foul smell assaulted his senses. Standing before him was an old man in a crisp black suit, sharply dressed in clothes that appeared new and pristine, a stark contrast to the foul odor that clung to him. The man's face was pale, with deeply sunken eyes and dark circles that looked almost painted on, his expression cold and detached. Phillips managed to greet the man and asked if he needed help. The man's voice, heavy with the same putrid odor, asked directly, "Are you the doctor treating the old woman with lung cancer?" Phillips, unsettled by the question and the overwhelming stench, tried to step back, but the man moved closer, showing an unsettling level of interest in the patient's condition. Phillips, trying to maintain his composure, turned to the medical records, searching for the woman's file. Out of habit, he asked, "Are you her family?" The old man paused before responding, "I'm her family." Phillips continued to explain the woman's deteriorating state and how she had been discharged for home care. The man listened quietly, his eyes welling up with tears that contrasted sharply with his emotionless face. "How much longer does she have?" the man asked, his tone flat and disconcerting. Phillips hesitated but eventually replied that she likely had a month or 2 left. The man nodded, bowing deeply in thanks before turning and walking away, the foul stench trailing behind him. The next day, Phillips recounted the encounter to his supervisor and described the strange visitor to the woman's daughters. They were shocked and insisted that their father had died years ago, and there were no other male relatives who would have visited the hospital. Phillips couldn't reconcile the vivid memory of the man with their statements. He vividly recalled the man's presence, his suit, and that terrible smell. He tried to rationalize it. Perhaps it was a distant relative or someone unknown to the daughters, but the encounter haunted him. Later that day, the eldest daughter visited Phillips with a photograph of her father, asking if the man in the photo was the one he had seen. Phillips immediately recognized the suit, the eyes, the unmistakable face of the man who had visited him the night before. He was buried in this suit, she whispered, her voice filled with a mix of sadness and disbelief. In the weeks that followed, Phillips couldn't escape the feeling that the old man's presence had left a mark on the hospital. Nurses began reporting strange occurrences near the old woman's former room. Lights flickering, shadows moving in the periphery of their vision, and the faint, inexplicable stench of rot that seemed to come and go without warning. One night, Phillips was working late when he noticed the familiar, nauseating smell lingering in his office. It was subtle at first, but unmistakable. He checked every corner, every drawer, but found nothing out of place. The smell, though faint, felt like a reminder of the man's visit, a presence that refused to leave. Phillips began to hear whispers among the staff. Small talk about the strange occurrences, items misplaced, and the unsettling feeling of being watched when alone on the ward. Though the logical side of him dismissed it as paranoia, he couldn't ignore the growing dread that something was amiss. The last encounter occurred weeks later, during a quiet shift. Phillips was alone, catching up on paperwork, when he noticed the door to his office slowly creak open, despite being sure he had locked it. He hesitated, half expecting a nurse, but the hallway was empty. An unsettling compulsion pulled him toward the old woman's room. The room was dark and untouched since her discharge. As Phillips entered, the stench of decay was overpowering, filling the air with the same sickening odor from before. Standing by the window was a faint figure, the same old man, dressed in the familiar black suit. Phillips stood frozen as the figure stared out the window, seemingly unaware of Phillips' presence. The air grew colder, the room darker, and Phillips' breath caught in his throat. He tried to speak, but no words came. The figure slowly began to dissolve, fading into the darkness as if it had never been there. Phillips left the room, locking the door behind him. He knew that what he had seen was not a hallucination or a trick of the light. It was a final farewell, a spectral presence that had come back for reasons Phillips would never understand. Phillips never spoke of the encounter again, but the memory haunted him. The old man's ghostly visit remained an unsolved mystery, a chilling reminder that some spirits linger, bound by unfinished business or unspoken goodbyes. For Phillips, every time he passed that room, he felt the weight of something unresolved, a shadow of the past that would never fully fade. The room remained closed, avoided by staff who sensed something off. Phillips continued his work, but he would never forget the man in the black suit and the stench that followed. It was a lingering shadow, a silent reminder that some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed. Chapter 4. Dr. Phillips had seen numerous patients come and go, each with their own fears and anxieties, but none were as unsettling as the case of Mr. Carter. Mr. Carter was a middle-aged man who had been brought into the emergency room after a severe car accident. He was in desperate need of surgery due to multiple fractures and internal bleeding. As Phillips prepared for the operation, he noticed that Mr. Carter seemed particularly agitated. Before the surgery, Mr. Carter confided in Phillips about a nightmare that had been haunting him since the accident. "I keep seeing this figure," he said, his voice shaky. "A man in old clothes, standing at the foot of my bed. He grabs my neck and whispers that my time is up. Feels so real, like he's waiting for me." Phillips, attributing the man's fear to post-traumatic stress, tried to calm him down, assuring him that the surgery would go smoothly and that it was just a dream. The operation proceeded without complications, and Mr. Carter was transferred to the recovery room. Phillips conducted his post-op checks as usual, then returned to his duties elsewhere in the hospital. A few hours later, a nurse urgently paged him, saying that the patient's room monitor had picked up something strange. Phillips hurried back to the room, where a small crowd of nurses had gathered, staring at the monitor with disbelief. The camera feed showed a faint, shadowy figure standing beside Mr. Carter's bed. Phillips' heart raced as he remembered Carter's words. The figure was indistinct, but its movements were slow and deliberate, as if it were reaching for something. Phillips entered the room cautiously, his eyes darting to the corners, half expecting to see the figure in person. But the room was empty, save for Mr. Carter, who was still under the effects of anesthesia. The monitor continued to show the shadowy presence, though nothing was visible to the naked eye. Phillips checked the equipment and camera, but everything seemed to be in working order, no malfunctions, no explainable glitches. As Phillips stood beside the bed, Mr. Carter's heart rate spiked, setting off the alarm on the heart monitor. Phillips leaned in closer, trying to assess the situation, when suddenly Mr. Carter's eyes shot open. He gasped for breath, his hands clutching at his throat as if he were being strangled. Phillips called for assistance, and nurses rushed in to stabilize the patient. But the unsettling feeling of being watched lingered. Mr. Carter finally regained consciousness hours later, visibly shaken and pale. When Phillips asked what had happened, Carter described the exact same figure that had appeared in his dream. A man with a shadowy form, dressed in old clothes, who had been choking him while whispering threats in his ear. It was identical to what the camera had shown, yet there was no physical evidence of anyone else in the room. Phillips ordered a thorough review of the monitor footage and the room's security logs. But nothing explained the shadowy figure. The camera feed was clear, and no unauthorized personnel had entered. The hospital administration dismissed it as a technical glitch, but Phillips and the nurses who had seen the footage knew that it was something else entirely. Phillips, unable to let the incident go, began researching similar occurrences. He found that several other patients in that particular room had reported seeing similar figures, shadowy presences that haunted their sleep and invaded their recovery. One patient had even refused to stay in the room, claiming that the ghostly figure had promised to take him away. Staff records indicated multiple reports of electrical disturbances, faulty equipment, and even unexplained cold spots in the room, but nothing had ever been formally investigated. Phillips continued his own investigation, speaking discreetly with other doctors and nurses who had worked the night shifts. Many shared unsettling stories of shadows flitting across the walls, temperature drops, and an inexplicable feeling of dread when near the room. Some spoke of seeing figures out of the corner of their eye, only for them to disappear when looked at directly. A few nights later, Phillips found himself on the late shift again. As he walked past Mr. Carter's room, he couldn't help but glance at the monitor. The shadowy figure was back, standing at the exact same spot by the bed, motionless. Phillips' heart pounded as he pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air was cold, and the room felt suffocatingly quiet. Phillips approached the bed cautiously, half expecting the figure to vanish as it had before. Instead, he felt a sudden, intense pressure around his chest, as if something unseen were squeezing the air out of his lungs. He staggered back, struggling to breathe, his vision blurring at the edges. Just as he felt he might pass out, the pressure lifted, and he stumbled against the wall, gasping for air. The room returned to its eerie stillness, and Phillips found himself staring at the empty space beside Mr. Carter's bed, where the shadow had been. He quickly exited, shaken and pale, feeling a cold sweat on his brow. When Mr. Carter was well enough to be discharged, he called Phillips over, insisting on sharing one last thing. "I saw him again," Mr. Carter said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The man in old clothes. He was angry, like I wasn't supposed to survive. He told me he'd be waiting." Phillips nodded, unable to offer any rational explanation. He watched as Mr. Carter was wheeled out of the hospital, knowing that whatever haunted him might never truly let go. Phillips couldn't help but feel that the shadowy figure wasn't just a product of Carter's mind, but something that had attached itself to that room, waiting for its next victim. The hospital eventually decided to move all patients out of the room, citing the ongoing technical issues as the official reason. But those who had experienced the eerie presence knew it was more than just faulty equipment. For Phillips, the room remained a stark reminder that some nightmares don't end when you wake up, and some ghosts never leave. Phillips continued his duties, but the shadowy figure stayed with him, a constant reminder of the unseen forces that lurk in the hospital's quietest corners. Even today, he can't pass by that room without feeling the prickle of fear, the weight of unseen eyes watching. And though he never speaks of it, Phillips knows that the figure is still there, waiting in the shadows for its next chance to reach out from the dark. As Dr. Phillips finished recounting his chilling experiences, a heavy silence filled the room. Each story, though separate, painted a haunting picture of the unseen forces that lurked within the hospital's sterile walls. From the unexplained alarms to shadowy figures and ghostly visits, Phillips had encountered the unexplainable, testing the limits of his rational mind. He leaned back in his chair, the weight of his memories evident on his face. "Hospitals," he said quietly, "are places of life and death. Every day we see people at their most vulnerable, on the brink of something we can't fully understand. But it's not just the living who linger here. Sometimes, it's what's left behind." Phillips paused, his gaze distant, as if reliving those nights once more. "These weren't just stories," he continued, his voice laced with an undeniable truth. "They were reminders that no matter how much we try to control life and death, there are forces beyond our understanding that defy explanation. Shadows that creep in the night, voices that whisper in the silence, and eyes that watch when no one is looking." For Phillips, each encounter left an indelible mark. The hospital, with its endless corridors and darkened rooms, was more than just a place of healing. It was a threshold between worlds, where the past sometimes refused to rest. He knew he would never forget the faces, the voices, or the cold, unseen presence that followed him. In the end, Phillips concluded, these stories aren't just about fear. They're about the unknown. They remind us that not everything can be fixed. Not every spirit can be laid to rest. Some doors, once opened, never truly close. And sometimes, the things that haunt us the most are the ones we never see coming. Phillips' stories were not just tales of terror. They were a sobering reminder of the mysteries that exist just beyond the veil of the visible world. As he got up to leave, the room felt colder, the shadows a little darker. His experiences served as a cautionary tale, a whisper in the back of your mind that maybe, just maybe, there's something more lurking in the quietest corners of our lives. The lights flickered as he walked away, leaving behind an air of unease, a final reminder that the stories were far from over. For in the world of the living, it is easy to forget that we are not alone, that every now and then, something unseen may reach out from the dark. And when it does, all you can do is hope that it's not coming for you next. Hospitals may hide dark secrets, but supernatural encounters aren't confined to any one place. Our next story takes us across the world to Tokyo, where a haunted stairwell has trapped its victims in ways that defy reason. Before Narita Airport was built, this land was once an ancient burial ground. Local legends tell of a cursed woman who was buried here, a woman who had suffered greatly in life due to a lost love. Even in death, her spirit could not find peace, and it is said that her ghost roams the area, seeking out those who share her tragic fate. When the airport was constructed, this woman's grave was accidentally unearthed. The workers, unaware of the land's dark history, carelessly displaced her remains. Since then, the stairwell has been considered cursed. On certain nights, her spirit is said to wander the stairwell, searching for her next victim. Those unfortunate enough to encounter her are said to be haunted by her vengeful spirit, experiencing an unexplainable terror. Jack and Emily, a couple from Australia, were passionate travelers. In the fall of 2023, they decided to spend a long vacation in Tokyo, Japan. The vibrant streets of Tokyo, serene shrines, and the majestic Mount Fuji were all on their itinerary. But little did they know that their journey would start with a terrifying experience that would leave a mark on them forever. Their flight landed smoothly at Tokyo's Narita International Airport. As they waited to collect their luggage, an unexpected announcement came over the PA system. For some unexplained reason, their flight's luggage pickup area had been changed. They were instructed to go to a secluded part of the airport, accessed through a back staircase. While this seemed a bit unusual, they decided to follow the directions. The couple followed the signs, leading them into a quiet, dimly lit corridor. There were no other passengers around, no bustling airport staff, just the eerie glow of the lights reflecting off the polished floor. "This feels a bit off," Emily whispered, clutching Jack's hand. Yeah, it doesn't look like a place meant for passengers, Jack replied, frowning but continuing down the corridor. They reached an unremarkable iron door, marked by a handwritten sign that read, "Back staircase, baggage collection." Pushing open the door, they were met with a narrow, steep staircase. The walls were peeling, the place reeked of dampness, and a faint musty odor filled the air. As they descended the stairs, the atmosphere grew heavier. The lights flickered erratically, casting fleeting shadows that seemed to move on their own. The air felt thick and cold, a sharp contrast to the warmth of the airport terminal above. Each step on the metal stairs produced an unnerving creak that echoed through the narrow stairwell, amplifying their growing sense of dread. Is it just me? Or is it getting colder? Emily shivered, feeling a chill that seemed to seep into her bones. It's definitely strange. Let's grab our bags quickly and get out of here, Jack said, trying to keep his voice steady. Suddenly, Emily stopped in her tracks, her hand gripping Jack's arm tightly. Did you hear that? Jack listened intently. Yes, there it was, a faint sound of footsteps echoing from the depths of the staircase. The problem was they were the only ones there. As they continued descending, the footsteps persisted, growing louder with each step, as if something unseen was following them, mimicking their movements. The further they went, the clearer the sound became, and the closer it seemed. Jack, I've got a bad feeling about this. Emily's voice trembled with fear. Then, without warning, the lights flickered again. But this time they went out completely, plunging the stairwell into total darkness. Emily let out a frightened gasp, clutching Jack's hand even tighter. They stood frozen, too terrified to move. Hold on, I'll use my phone's flashlight, Jack said, his voice barely a whisper. He pulled out his phone and switched on the light. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the stairwell, but when it reached the bottom, both of them gasped in horror. At the base of the stairs stood a shadowy figure, facing away from them. The figure was completely still, like a statue, but what was most chilling was its appearance. Clothed in tattered garments that seemed to belong to a bygone era, and faint traces of something dark, possibly blood, stained the fabric. Let's get out of here now. Emily's voice was barely controlled panic. Without a word, Jack turned, and they began to hurry back up the stairs. But as they did, the footsteps behind them started again, this time faster, heavier, as if the figure was chasing them. Emily's heart pounded in her chest, and Jack's grip on her hand tightened as they quickened their pace. As they scrambled up the stairs, Emily's mind flashed back to something she had read online just days before their trip. It was an article about haunted places in Tokyo, and one of the stories mentioned an old legend about a ghostly figure seen in the stairwells of Narita Airport. She hadn't thought much of it at the time, dismissing it as just another urban legend. But now, with the heavy footsteps echoing behind them, she couldn't shake the feeling that they had stumbled into something far more sinister. Jack, do you remember that article I told you about? The one with the haunted stairwell? Emily gasped, struggling to catch her breath as they reached the top of the stairs. Jack nodded, his face pale. Yeah, but I thought it was just a story. This feels too real. Just as they were about to reach the door leading back to the corridor, the footsteps suddenly stopped. The abrupt silence was almost more terrifying than the noise itself. They stood there, panting, afraid to look back. Do you think it's gone? Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. I don't know, but I'm not taking any chances, Jack replied, his hand trembling as he reached for the door handle. They pushed through the door and rushed into the corridor, but their relief was short-lived. The corridor, which had seemed dim and eerie before, now felt like a lifeline to safety. But even as they hurried towards the baggage collection room, the memory of those footsteps and that shadowy figure clung to them, a lingering sense of dread that refused to dissipate. Back in the main terminal, surrounded by the comforting noise of travelers and the bright airport lights, Jack and Emily retrieved their luggage. But something had changed. The fear from the stairwell seemed to have followed them, like a dark cloud hanging over their heads. Emily couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time she glanced over her shoulder, She half expected to see that shadowy figure standing there, just out of the corner of her eye. She knew it was irrational, but the fear was too real, too palpable to ignore. Jack tried to stay calm for Emily's sake, but he couldn't stop his hands from shaking. The memory of those footsteps, of that cold, damp air, played over and over in his mind. He couldn't help but wonder if they had really escaped whatever it was that had followed them up the stairs. Even after they left the airport and checked into their hotel, the sense of unease persisted. Every shadow in their room seemed darker, every creak of the floorboards louder. That night, Emily dreamt of the stairwell, of the shadowy figure that had chased them, and she woke up with a start, her heart racing, only to find Jack sitting up beside her, his face pale and drawn. "I can't stop thinking about it," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "What if it wasn't just our imagination? What if we brought something back with us?" Emily shuddered at the thought, but she didn't have an answer. All she knew was that the fear they had felt in that stairwell had followed them, seeping into their thoughts, their dreams, their very sense of safety. Over the next few days, they tried to enjoy their trip, but the memory of that night hung over them like a dark cloud. Every time they passed by a staircase, Emily would feel a pang of anxiety, and Jack would find himself glancing back, just to make sure nothing was following them. They never spoke of it again, but the experience left a scar on their minds, a reminder that sometimes, the most ordinary places can hide the most extraordinary horrors. Jack and Emily never mentioned that night to anyone. Whenever someone asked about their trip to Tokyo, they would carefully avoid discussing what happened at the airport. This story serves as a reminder. Sometimes, it's not just beautiful sights we encounter on our journeys. Occasionally, we stumble upon things that defy explanation, lurking in places where we least expect them. Thank you all so much for watching this compilation of terrifying true stories. Your support means everything to me, and I'm truly grateful for each and every one of you who takes the time to enjoy these chilling tales. I hope these stories brought you a thrill, but more than that, I wish you nothing but happiness and good fortune. May you always find light in the darkness, and may luck and joy follow you wherever you go. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to keep the horror coming. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and take care.